Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel called Potential for Cooperation in Eastern Part of the North American Arctic. With me this morning, in this beautiful morning in Reykjavik, I have Rasmus Leander Nielsen, who's assistant professor at, I can see you, sorry, I think I'm getting old, can't read that. So, where are you, professor?
Just say University of Greenland.
Okay, University of Greenland. I like that. And I have with me Anna Soaz, a PhD candidate at Ottawa University, University of Ottawa, and Andrew Chater, sorry, with the University College in, Andrew.
Russia University College rhymes with Russia University College. But
Thank
Russia.
you, thank you very much.
No, but helpful.
So next year we'll ask for bigger letters in the program for people like me. I asked each participant to talk for about 12 minutes. So it'll give us time for a Q&A session after the presentation. And we're starting with, in this order, with Rasmus Lander Nielsen.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for the invitation to Matthew. Unfortunately, couldn't be here, but send him my regard and say thank you for being able to talk about something that is close to my heart, collaborating with our Canadian neighbors in the eastern part of the North American Arctic. I'm also the head of a fairly new research center called NACIFIC at the University of Greenland. And one of my colleagues is here, Maria Kren, sitting in the front row. NACIFIC, and there's also a Canadian name sister that I will show you in the next slides. But one of the things that we are focusing on is bringing like locally anchored knowledge of foreign and security policy being done from Greenland. And we have a fairly broad definition of security policy. It could be that we enroll PhD students who do indigenous rights, Arctic Council, etc., etc. What we are mostly looking at is a Greenlandic foreign policy in different versions. Some of the things that we think is very, very important is first off is to have locally anchored research and dissemination in Greenland and from Greenland to the rest of the world and to strengthen knowledge base in Greenland. But it's also what we are, I would say, so far quite successful at is making networks. Especially we have a focus now on Canada and the US, also Iceland. It's been difficult during the corona pandemic, but we already of this year have been able to meet quite often with also Canadian scholars. So bringing international networks to Greenland and also introducing Greenlandic knowledge about some very, very interesting cases that we're working on. There's actually I was at a conference I think it was back in May, where there was a company called Nasiduk in Inuktitut. So basically the same idea that it's an outlook post from high above looking. It's an old tradition by Inuit to be able to see if the weather was actually good enough to go sailing that particular day. They do something completely different from us. It's a company doing technical facility management solutions in the Canadian North, but it's Inuit-led. And I was thinking when she did the presentation, a really interesting presentation, there was some lessons to be learned from Greenland. And that's only part of that, what I'm going to talk to. We can actually learn quite a lot from each other. And Greenland could learn from some of the evidences that she was showing. For today's fairly briefly talk, I will do 4 cases. The first one is that I think there is a connection between OPSA, where we also have a guest from today, like doing data-driven research based on people who actually live in the Arctic. That could be quantitatively, but I think that there's a common line of interest that I know there's been doing some expert surveys from OPSAC also quite recently. I would talk briefly about two projects that I have been starting or have at least been talking to with Whitney Lackenbauer, who's in the first row. The first one is the end of the Whiskey War, as you might have heard of. We have a fairly quickly written paper in the upcoming Arctic Yearbook, but have talked about doing some other studies, maybe even with the main negotiators, because Whitney knows that the Canadian chief negotiator, I know the Danish and the Greenlandic, and we all met in Nuuk back in late August. That could be quite interesting. Then there's a project that is only Whitney's project about Inuit Rangers, but I have the idea, and I also know from some quite important Greenlandic politicians, and Sven Hardenberg, you might see in Borgen, was very interested in some of the ideas that Greenland could actually learn from this case. And then I would flip that coin and say there's actually some things about the evolution of Greenlandic foreign policy or ParaDiplomacy that might be of interest. And I know that for a fact, talking to Canadian colleagues over time. And this is not an exhaustive list. We could talk about NORAD, Arctic Council, ICC, different version of security, food security, environmental security, etc., but also hard security. I will start with my first case studies is data-driven research, where me and Maria Kren, who sits here, did the first survey on foreign security policy a year and a half ago, and we are in the process of making the second part of the survey. I also took this slide because it shows that there's an Arctic axis of who the general public in Greenland thinks that Greenland should collaborate more with in the future. So Iceland came up on top, but the Arctic Council, but also Canada. So it's like, you could say, like collaborating also on a scholarly basis is based on public demand or public sentiments. There is this idea in the general public that the Canadian neighbors are someone we really want to have global collaboration with. Hopefully in a few years we can actually fly from Nuuk to Halifax or to Nunavut. That's not possible. We have to go via Iceland. But it is something that's quite interesting. And the argument is that I think some of the research I've seen from Canadian scholars that is really, really interesting is data-driven. It could be expert survey like OPSA have done recently and over time. I talked with some friends in Nunavut and said it would be impossible to do a survey like we did in Greenland. Simply isn't a setup, but maybe in the future we could collaborate, we could come with insight from what we did in Greenland and do something similar in the northern part of Canada and do some comparative study that would be really, really interesting, or like a pan-Inuit survey eventually when the setup is done for that. There's also been other surveys in the Faroe Islands and in Iceland and in Norway that is quite close to ours. Two other examples or cases that I will bring forward is the Hans Island, the Whiskey War, that ended back in June. And for years we have been, nothing really. This goes back a long time, decades, back to the 70s. There was a lot of conflict back in the turn of the millennium, 2004, 2005, etc. And when they actually found a solution, I was like, yeah, mate, it's a funny case. But when we started talking about it and doing a bit of research and also going back in the archives, when did that expedition actually find Hans Island and how many Inuits actually used it back in the days? It's actually a more interesting case than I realized before. So I think Whitney and I, hopefully also some of the negotiation, maybe some of you in the audience, could look more into this really weird case of this little, in Greenlandic it's called like the, Kidney Island, and someone said it looked like a toad or something, but it is actually quite interesting, and it's also interesting because the negotiation got lumped together with some other issues that I actually think are more important than this island in particular, things about the continental shelves. So from a case that sounded like, yeah, it's funny enough to like spend half an hour talking to a journalist when they found a bargaining solutions. There's actually more to it that I think that we will work on. And then, as I stated, this is not my research topic, but something that there's quite a lot of work from the Canadian side about the Canadian Rangers, Inuit Rangers in the far north, that I think it could be quite important for some lessons learned to Greenland. In Greenland, in Gangerslustok, Sønder Strømfjord, if you ever went through the international airport in Greenland, you have been there. There's going to be a new emergency preparedness school in the not too distant future. And I think when we are making progress in that school and also in terms of working with the Arctic Command, the Danish defense, there could be some really, really interesting. And I only got this from hearing a witness back in March. He was giving a presentation at university and also at the Arctic Circle Forum in late Nuuk. And especially in late August, I was talking to some Greenlandic politicians. They were sitting in the room when there was discussion about some of these things, and I could really tell that the interest of this case is there and could be potentially quite interesting. So I think what we will do in the beginning is maybe just to do a policy brief or an op-ed in the newspaper and then translate it into Greenland and then see what happens from there. I don't think personally it's going to be one of my key research areas, but I think the lessons from this case could potentially be really, really important. So this is two other cases that either we have actually a borderline now between Greenland and Canada, but also some lessons learned from Canada to Greenland. And my last thing I will just talk briefly about in my last 4 minutes, I guess, is some of the lessons learned from Greenland, because I actually think that the evolution of Greenlandic foreign policy is a very, very interesting case also for I talked to Canadian scholars also like during the last 5 years. They've been really interested in hearing some of the evolution of Greenlandic paradiplomacy. This is my own kit that I always talk about the EU or the European Communities referendums back in 72, and we actually had like the 50 years anniversary of what I would say the critical juncture or the trigger effect of Greenlandic foreign policy. There was some dynamics going on before that, but that the 2nd of October of 72 of the referendum is a key date in newer Greenlandic history, because Greenland voted no to join the European Union, but the votes were just lumped together with the Danish vote. So Greenland was kind of forced into the European communities at the time. And that triggered a political awakening and a twin process of both domestic politics and foreign policy. So you had a Greenlandic member of the European Parliament back from the late 70s. You had the whole process of Greenlandic parties. The home rule process started in the furtherance of this. So it's quite interesting to see how the evolution is up to today, where the Greenlandic foreign policy and the MFA is a quite developed entity in Greenlandic, the nation building of Greenland, that I think is quite interesting for other entities. Could be maybe not one-to-one to Nunavut or the territories, but there are some lessons learned in how you can develop and paradiplomacy is like a generic term. You also have paradiplomacy in Switzerland, in Germany, etc., etc. But this is something we use as analytical lenses to analyze cases like Greenland. That is quite interesting. And for my last comment, I would suggest, I don't know if there's any Canadian politicians in the room, but otherwise you can convey to them. There is a growing diplomatic scene in Nuuk. We had the Icelandic consulate for almost 10 years in Nuuk, depicted on the hill up there. This doesn't fit the actual geography of Nuuk, but it's just showing where it is. There is some 4 years ago, the US opened a consulate. The EU was supposed to open a consulate this year, but that's been postponed for different reasons. And I know for a fact that some of the Greenlandic diplomats and politicians would really welcome a consulate from the Canadian side, and also having discussion. So Greenland has a representation, Washington, D.C., also covering Canada, but don't really have the time to do too much. So there's been talk to also upgrade it to Ottawa or maybe even to Nunavut. But that was see. So I think you should tell the congressman to send some diplomats to Nuuk, because it is a growing and emerging diplomatic scene there. Renak.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rasmus. Now we'll turn to Anna.
How does it work? Okay. So, hi everyone, thank you for coming. This project is funded by the Secretariat aux Relations Canadiennes du Québec, Secretariat for Canadian Relations Québec, with Professor Jean-François Savard and Mathieu Landriot as project leaders. Okay, slide 2. About our objectives and research questions, we had 2 main research questions for our project. Is there a will to establish a forum of cooperation in the Eastern North American Arctic? And what are the incentives or obstacles to institutional cooperation in Eastern North American Arctic region? Cooperation in the Arctic region has been fruitful in the past few decades with the creation of several multilateral organizations and fora covering the entire circumpolar north. Forums have been created to serve as catalysts to bring together decision makers from different backgrounds to promote dialogue and exchange of ideas. Of course, a new situation with Russia is a topic to discuss here. Accordingly, we set to inquire on the possibility of creating a forum of cooperation specific for the Eastern North American Arctic. So we have conducted 6 interviews total of foreign affairs government officials and 1 elected representative from Greenland to answer our 2 research questions. To answer them, we conducted our interviews through 5 questions. The set of 5 questions were about 1, the perceived potential in a regional cooperation organization, such as a forum. 2, the issues or topic. 3, obstacles and challenges to its establishment. 4, the role of the national government. And 5, but not least, the role of civil society. The answers were then codified, and the codes came from the interviews themselves and not from pre-planned grid of analysis, grounded theory methodology. The themes emanating from the interviews were categorized in 2 sections: positive critiques, encoded potential, and negative critiques, encoded critiques, about the potential creation of this forum. After the completion of all interviews, subcodes were attributed by themes to reflect opinions and understandings in each broad category in detail. Subcodes include, in critiques, added value by comparison, capacity, boundaries and competences, added value by purpose, contextual negative signal, and political will. In potential, we have positive contextual signal, boundaries, comparison, government level, involvement, and purpose. The subcodes describe the statements made by the respondents and categorize them in order to best respond to the research questions. As you can see, the codes mirror each other. Oops, nope, there's a thing here. Anyways, the codes mirror each other, and this mirroring of argumentation was a finding of our research. So what first came out as a certainty across the board was the consensus on the leading role of subnational governments and the essential involvement of civil society linked to the preferred issues, which I will come back to later on. The involvement of Inuit organizations, such as the aforementioned Inuit Circumpolar Council, as well as Nunavik Tungavik Incorporated, were seen as fundamental, also from the point of view of reconciliation. The Inuit Circumpolar Council was the most often mentioned civil society organization. To bounce back on what I just mentioned, the mirroring effect, the same argument, for instance, the existence present of other comparative organizations and fora, could be spinned in either a positive light or a negative light. The codes which encapsulated the most references are in potential, the purpose, 25 references, added value by comparison, 15, and positive contextual signal, 14. In critiques, boundaries and competences, 23 references, added value by comparison, 20, and capacity, 18. The added value of a separate North American Arctic Cooperative Forum is contentious among our respondents, based on the mirroring effect that I have previously highlighted. The existence of established Arctic cooperation organizations for venues therefore pose a double-edged sword for the establishment of a specific regional. What political message does this send for the usefulness or relevance of the Arctic Council in the region? What would be the added value in terms of governance? The representative of the government of Quebec and the representative of the government of Denmark both had marked doubts about the creation of a new cooperative forum due to the already existing working presence of similar cooperative structures. The new structure does not seem to generate sufficient added value and would be redundant given the presence of the Arctic Council for Quebec and Denmark, but also of this, the Arctic Circle Assembly for Quebec only. These two respondents suggested that the relationships between Greenland and Canadian jurisdictions can already happen and be strengthened in these cooperative venues. Next, all respondents have mentioned trade and people-to-people ties as areas of regional cooperation within their respective constitutional boundaries. The representative of the Government of Canada emphasizes trade and commerce as well as family links and cultural development. The representative of the Government of Greenland opens the door to the many possibilities while making clear that defense and military issues cannot be considered as they're not within the jurisdictional rights. And the representative of the Government of Nunavut in Quebec, how many times can you say representatives, both emphasize the need for greater regional cooperation on marine protection. The representative of Quebec particularly putting forward the need for greater scientific coordination and cooperation. Trade. For instance, in hunting, mineral extraction, and digital infrastructures is mentioned as a potential venue for regional cooperation by both the representative of Greenland, Nunavut, Canada, and by the Greenlandic elected official. The elected official also makes clear the need for regional cultural exchanges. So, a consensus that trade and cultural people-to-people ties are firstly within the constitutional boundaries, and secondly, are issues of great importance across the borders for which greater cooperation and exchange are in demand. The code potential purpose has 25 references in all 5 interviews, all but the representative of the Government of Denmark, making it the most prevalent code across. There is no doubt that furthering Eastern North American Arctic cooperation is of interest, and that there is a need to further collaboration. So while our respondents from Canada, Nunavut, and Greenland see great potential in the establishment of a new regional cooperative forum, the two main obstacles, competences and capacity, are key to the feasibility of its creation. Questions related to agenda setting are indissociable from concern about constitutional boundaries and the distribution of powers in the different jurisdictions under study. While further cooperation is needed, as reasserted by all respondents, this cooperation cannot impede on existing mandates determined by the respective constitutions. The second code, Critique, Boundaries and Competences, has 23 references, all but the Government of Canada, which is interesting. The second most frequent quote behind potential purpose. Therefore, while there is a very high potential in terms of purpose, meaning that there is a demand, the different competences of the governments of the region and the constitutional boundaries of what could become a subject of cooperation could hamper this potential. This line of limitations was expressed by all participants and touched, and I think this is perhaps the most important one, touched on one of the most fundamental dynamics influencing Northern community, the issue of accessibility, both virtual and physical, with poor digital infrastructures and lack of high-speed connectivity, great distances between jurisdictions with the lack of air or sea cargo connection between northeastern Canada and Greenland, which was a point highlighted by the governments of Canada, Nunavut, Greenland, as well as by the Greenland elected official. So based on my concluding remarks, based on these results, There is therefore a consensus, right, that the leading role of subnational governments and civil society, and that there is no doubt that regional cooperation must be enhanced. The elephant in the room, however, is truly the main limitation: limited financial resources, which bleeds into limited connectivity issues. Also, and perhaps this is a bit of more of a forecast, what about the financial crisis to come? And what about inflation? What is that going to cause, short term and long term? I guess we will see. Is this the last one? Yes. Okay, I'm on time. Slide 7. About the role of national governments, here our respondents from the governments of Canada and Denmark seem to not exactly share the same vision. The respondent from the government of Canada sees this role as more of a convener, whereas the respondent from the government of Denmark does not see any role Denmark could have, as it would be solely within the jurisdiction of the government of Greenland, therefore in terms of budget questions as well. Government of Canada is in a role of support without driving the process. It is in a position to complement and help local stakeholders fulfill their objectives. One potential role was also for the Department of Global Affairs and of the Government of Canada to coordinate their actions and participation of other federal and national departments in such a cooperative venture. Overall, there is great enthusiasm on enhancing, furthering, strengthening regional Eastern North American Arctic cooperation. The creation of a venue, whether that may be an independent forum or part of an existing structure, therefore only seems to be a matter of time based on our results. These findings are also consistent with existing research on the topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. And so far, our presenters have respected their time limit. That's fantastic. So we're turning now to Andrew Chater. Andrew?
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming out this morning. The question that I want to answer really is, what is Greenland exactly? Now, my apologies to the Greenlanders in the room. We know what Greenland is. I mean, is it a state? Is it a sub-state actor? What exactly is its role in international relations? I come at this from a Canadian perspective, and if we're going to have cooperation between Canada and Greenland, I think we need to understand what Greenland's role is in international relations, especially in Canada, with the perennial question of Quebec sovereignty always part of the national dialogue. So I want to talk about Greenland's place in international relations and also discuss opportunities potentially for Canada to grow cooperation with Greenland. Many sources talk about Greenland as being a state, having state-like powers in international relations, pretty much being in the same league as small powers. I've seen it referred to as a state in waiting. It's talking about it as a state. And certainly there's a good basis to talk about Greenland in state-like terms. The Act on Greenland Self-Government from 2009 recognizes Greenlandic self-determination. One thing that I think is really interesting is that it did have a moment of independence in the past. During the Second World War, during the Nazi occupation of Denmark, Greenland's governors were on their own. The Danish ambassador in the United States negotiated a defense agreement with the United States. During the Second World War, Greenland was a U.S. military outpost. It was a source for cryolite. By the end of the Second World War, Greenland had 13 American Army bases and 4 American naval bases. In 1951, the U.S. opened an air base in Greenland and operated 4 radar stations from 1958 until 1990. As Rasmus mentioned, in 1972, Denmark was forced to join the European Economic Community, even though 70%, I believe, of Greenlanders voted against the proposal. However, in 1982, it was able to leave the EEC due to a number of reasons, a desire to maintain more control over fisheries, for example. It became an associated overseas territory in 1985. More recently, Greenland hosted the meetings that led to the Ilulissat Declaration. It lobbied Denmark to host the meetings despite disagreement and protest from the Inuit Circumpolar Council. South Korea's president visited Greenland in 2012 without the Danish prime minister, or really much involvement from Denmark. China's Minister for Land and Resources visited in 2012. It's clear that its Greenland strategy is separate from its broader European strategy or its Denmark strategy. I could go on with examples. At this assembly, President Grimson called the Prime Minister of Greenland a world leader, which I thought was very interesting. He equated the Prime Minister of Greenland with Canada's Governor-General Mary Simon, said that they were both Indigenous world leaders on this stage. Mary Simon is the head of state of a sovereign state, and the Prime Minister of Greenland is not. We wouldn't probably call the Governor of Alaska a world leader, and the Premier of Northwest Territories also was on the stage and was not referred to as a world leader. So I think this speaks to this unique role for Greenland. Other sources talk about Greenland as being a quasi-state in the same league as Palestine, Kosovo, Taiwan. An example from my own teaching. In my second year international relations class, I was preparing my lecture about the United Nations, and most textbooks say that almost every country is in the United Nations. So I was thinking, what is this almost? I think that every country is in the United Nations. Who is not? So I consulted some sources about things that could be in the United Nations that are not, and those articles pretty much all talked about Greenland as being an entity that could be a member of the United Nations but isn't. Those three examples that I gave, Palestine, Kosovo, and Taiwan, as well as all the other examples in those articles, are quasi-states because their status as being sovereign is not universally recognized. Several dozen states recognize them as being independent. Several dozen states do not recognize them as being independent. Greenland doesn't fit into that category. Nobody is disputing Greenland's status. It's not the case that some states are recognizing Greenland as independent while others are arguing that it's part of Denmark. Indigenous peoples organizations probably would emphasize and argue for Greenland's right to self-determination. So that might be different in how an international actor would describe the role of Greenland. Ultimately, Denmark relies on the annual economic block grant from Denmark, which is more than $500 million USD per year. Regions that seek independence frequently become involved in international relations to buttress its claim to sovereignty on the world stage. We see that in the Faroe Islands, we see that in Greenland, we see that in Scotland, all having foreign ministers, foreign secretaries equivalent on the international scene. Some sources talk about Greenland as being a ParaDiplomatic actor. I believe Rasmus used the term paradiplomacy in talking about Greenland. That refers to international relations by sub-national actors, things like Canadian provinces, American states. Greenland participates in a number of international forums that are specifically for sub-national actors. For example, Greenland sends delegations to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, as well as the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Greenland participates in Nordic forums. It's also part of the European Union Overseas Countries and Territories Associations. It's been active in the Arctic Council, though it does not have a special role in the Arctic Council. It has to work with Denmark to fulfill its goals in the institution. Various authors, for example, Tony Pennicott, the former premier of Yukon Territory, has suggested that the Arctic Council should create a special role for sub-state actors, possibly a special role for the Northern Forum, possibly a rotating permanent participant sort of status for sub-state actors, which potentially would provide a special role for Greenland. Greenland also collaborates with subnational actors in a cooperative way. In 2009, Nunavut and Greenland signed a memorandum of understanding concerning the preservation of polar bear populations, the goal being to share knowledge and best practices around conservation. And in 2015, Nunavut and Greenland signed a statement against the European Union seal ban, and there's other examples as well. All the sources talking about Greenland's foreign policy acknowledge it as being a region of global significance and global concern. Of course, we've heard many times at this assembly that the implications of climate change in Greenland are immense for the entire world. We've also heard a lot about the economic potential of Greenland. Greenland, for example, has rare earth minerals. China controls 97% of global rare earth elements production, so of course China has an interest in doing business in Greenland. Lots been made of Greenland's potential oil production, though it's become clear after about 2015 that the future is not that strong, and Greenland's government ceased offshore oil exploration in 2021. What I think is clear is that Greenland and Canada can cooperate more, and that Canada can treat Greenland in this quasi-state, state-in-waiting manner. So here's something that I wrote in a book chapter that I wrote in the past. Between Canada and Greenland, there are similar populations of Inuit living in each country, 65,000 in Canada and 50,000 in Greenland. The Inuit represent less than 1% of Canada's population, yet more than 90% of Greenland's population. The capitals of Greenland, Nuuk, and Canada's Arctic territory of Nunavut, Iqaluit, are closer together than the national capitals of Ottawa, Ontario, and Washington, D.C. Canada has a similar amount of Arctic tundra compared to Greenland, 2.6 million square kilometers compared to 2.2 million square kilometers. The political movement for Greenland's home rule emerged after the Second World War, more or less concurrently with the movement demanding responsible government in Canada's Arctic territories. One could argue that Canadians and Greenlanders are less regional neighbors than they are cultural cousins. Rasmus suggested we should have Canadian politicians making visits to Nuuk. I agree. It says in my notes, so we're on the same page there. Prime Minister of Canada can make an international visit to Greenland. There are sensitivities there because of the Quebec question. We have had Quebec attempting at various points to assert itself on the world stage, only to be slapped back by the government of Canada. But this is a different situation because the government of Greenland has a degree of support from the government of Denmark that Quebec does not have and has never had. What are we going to cooperate about? Well, there's always opportunities for scientific cooperation. That is often a good, less political area for international cooperation. The need for climate change research is always there and always immense, especially with tensions between Russia right now, and the need for good climate change research to continue. Rare earth element production is a potential area for economic cooperation if and when Greenland and the local communities in Greenland decide to exploit those minerals. Canada can and should be an investor in that economic potential and economic future. So I'm not sure where I'm out of time, but thanks very much. Oh,
2 minutes left.
Oh, 2 minutes left. Okay, well, there you go. All right, well, thank you. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Andrew. And thanks to all the participants. You made my life way easier by respecting your the allocated time, and it gave us like a good 20 minutes, more than 20 minutes for questions. So we'll take questions from the room. If you could please just tell us to whom your question is directed to. Yeah, Whitney.
Unless somebody else wants to go first.
No, they see
yeah,
it.
thanks for the presentations. Anne, I guess it's primarily directed towards you, but I'd love to hear from your counterparts on the panel as well. I mean, you focused on government entities. When I think of cooperation in the Eastern North American Arctic, I might look to the Pikialasorsuaq Commission, which did quite intense work, Inuit-led, supported by governments. So I wonder why, when you were doing the research design, and your team was doing the research design, your focus was on actors like the government of Quebec over, say, Kikikitani Inuit Association, or Nunavut Incorporated, actual rights holders in the region, vis-a-vis Greenland and family relations and kin relations across, or if you factored in Pikialasorsuaq and some of the ICC work that was done around that in scoping this possibility space.
Yeah. Sorry, it's stealing your mic. So there are two elements to the answer of this. The first one is a very practical one. When we reached out to people, we reached out to individuals, organizations, etc. The amount of respondents that came back to us was quite limited, which is also why, for instance, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador is not included in my findings. This is the reason behind. So there is, on the one hand, a very practical answer to that. The second part of this is because there is, when we have interviewed specifically for Greenland and Nunavut, there were elected officials, that's right, but there were also community leaders. They were not separate in some fancy office building. They were able to answer, for instance, on the part of people-to-people ties. And this was something that was very much emphasized over and over again, the cultural element of people-to-people ties on the ground. Like Andrew Chater says, regional cousins, and emphasize on that. So we were able, even though we faced methodological limitations because of the response that we got, we were able to gain some insight through those interviews with those officials from either the government of Greenland or the elected Greenlandic official. We were able to also put that in context and compare that with the government of Nunavut, who were able to, without of course us saying what the results of the interview was with Greenland, but they were actually very much on par with what they were saying. There was like a lot of correlation between what the government of Nunavut was saying and what the government of Greenland and the Greenlandic official were saying. So even though methodological limits, and I agree with you, this is something that needs to be discussed in the actual paper for sure, we were still able to gain some insight through that. And then we were, of course, also able to, sustain the answer with secondhand literature. So, we were basically doing our best. Thank you.
I have a couple of thoughts, not on your research, but on this the broader question, which is what is paradiplomacy exactly? Like, what is a sub-state actor? So paradiplomacy, we can take a kind of a hard or a soft definition, a narrow or a broad definition. So it's supposed to refer to international relations or foreign policy by sub-state actors. So what's a sub-state actor? Certainly like a territory in Canada or a province for sure. Greenland could be a sub-state actor. But then there's questions about whether something like the Inuit Circumpolar Council is a paradiplomatic actor. And I'm going to critique my own work because I've written about it as a paradiplomatic actor, but it's not really a sub-state actor. It's a supra-state actor. It exists at the level above the states because it involves representatives and represents people in 4 different countries. So this is the challenge of trying to include things like the Inuit Circumpolar Council as a paradiplomatic actor, because the question about whether it is a sub-state actor is maybe too academic a question, but from a methodological perspective, a challenge.
I would maybe take and leading into continuing from what you're saying, that I was mentioning that maybe Canada should contemplate having someone in Nuuk, and this is just from experience that you often hear that it's so difficult to get a reply from the self-ruled government, and we are quite lucky because we normally know who in the tower, where all the departments are, who we should call if you want an answer to this and this question. So it's actually much easier if you are collaborating or if you know how to deal with the Greenlandic government, because sometimes you can just send a ton of mails and you won't get any replies. But if you know what you're doing and also know that this guy will actually come back to you, but it can take 3 weeks. That happens also quite often. So again, just leaning into that argument that method-wise, I understand some of the problems. I have never done any research in Canada on these things, but just like knowing for a fact how difficult, and even more so if you're doing research in like some of the smaller towns of Greenland. Now our internet connection is going really fast in getting fast internet. But just a few years ago, if you had a survey, it would take like 15 minutes and cost 1,000 kroners or like 100 euros to open a PDF file. So it's getting easier, but there are some complications in doing research in Greenland that I can understand you getting into some of the problems as well.
Thank you. Maybe we should also add that the COVID was an obstacle for our research because we're supposed to travel, we're supposed to do a lot of things, and we got some answers from government officials saying like, we would really like to help you out with the research, but we're way too busy with fighting COVID. So that's one part of the answer as well.
And if I can just super quickly, like in a minute, follow up with Andrew, perhaps a bit on a more conceptual level, I guess more of an academic conversation here. I think what really poses a question of cross-border cooperation in Northeastern Arctic would really be what is the role of the border itself? And that is perhaps like a further conversation to have, but it's, I think, an interesting idea to look at what could something like Schengen bring to the table here in the North American Arctic. what is the role of the border? Because, for instance, when the representative of the government of Quebec was talking about marine protection and scientific cooperation, the fish doesn't care about an imaginary line on the map. Pollution doesn't care about a human construct that looks very, very pretty on papers. It doesn't care. So what is the future of borders if we're talking about environmental protection, if we're talking about cross-border cooperation? The closest link that Canada has to Greenland is 20 kilometers away. It's really, really close. And yet, to go from one place to another, it takes thousands of dollars, hours and hours and hours and hours. And for some Canadians, or for international people like me, it takes visas. So I guess that would be like my follow-up point remark from Andrew. What is the future of borders in our regions, and what could models like Schengen bring to our region? I guess that would be my more, I guess, academic, conceptual question back. Thank you.
Andrew?
Yeah, well, I'll kind of use this also. I've been thinking about, we were talking about we should cooperate more, but what are the areas for cooperation? You bring up borders. It's been suggested that Canada and Greenland should have an open border for the Inuit traveling between Canada and Greenland. And I say, let's do that. That is a positive area for international cooperation, a powerful international precedent. I think that there is a good basis for doing that in the spirit of reconciliation, recognizing the traditional territory of the Inuit rather than the colonial borders drawn on the ground, or through the sea in this case. But I think that there's a very good basis for doing that. And we're talking about international cooperation. We talked about finally resolving the long-standing Hans Island dispute, which in my opinion was a very silly dispute that should have been settled a decade before it was settled. But this is potentially a new national project that could be a very powerful one, I think.
And just regarding what you just said, Andrew, about some sort of a treaty for indigenous population for freely circulating in the region, there's already a precedent in Canada, between Canada and the U.S. for indigenous in the South that can cross freely the border. So there's probably is a model for that actually in Canada.
Can I ask a follow-up to Rasmus specifically on this, and maybe some of our other colleagues? How much might that kind of proposal coming from Canada ignite debates in Greenland about whether Greenland citizens should be considered Greenlanders, and certain political representatives in Greenland being very strong about that stance in certain parties, versus a model that's differentiating citizens and potentially being seen as Canada imposing its own reconciliation agenda, differentiating populations, polarizing populations, if you want to be inflammatory. I just wondered if there's any thoughts on whether a proposal like that might get upset.
In relation to Hans Island?
Just in general, so
yeah.
Andy's notion of an open border, broad-based.
Yeah, but we can take the Hans Island as a case, and as we also talked, there has been for quite a while, and Kubi Kleist, the former premier and currently the head of the ICC office in Nuuk, has been reiterating that argument over and over again, that we should come up with a new, not state-bound solutions like the Western societies normally be doing. Like you could have this new Inuit solution of an open border that's been discussed quite a lot, and he was actually criticizing also after the June agreement on the Hans Island that this was a missed opportunity to do something else. But what we also gathered from some of the discussion that came afterwards, that some of the normative ideas of the borderless Inuit home country should be respected. That was the idea of Hans Henrik, who the island is actually named after. That he was just going with some American-led expeditions back in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, and he didn't really see this as borderline. He didn't really care about that. And some of the Greenlandic Kenturias, was bringing that up in the discussion, that we should also take some of the normative, even though this is basically what international law does. You have borders and you can draw it, and Greenland got 53% or whatever, a little bit more than you guys did. Some of the normative aspects that we should abide to that as well. But there is quite a lot of Greenlandic politicians are like, if you can say, if you win the Greenland win the lottery and you can have just one thing you really want to do is to have a flight connection to Nunavut, because of the Inuit kinship is seen as important and being so difficult, as you were referring to, that it's costly, it's difficult to have that kinship and collaboration with Inuit in not just in Canada but also in Alaska and to some degree in Russia, that if we can fly across the border and having more opportunities to meet, and as you know, there was quite a big contingency from Nunavut in Canada in late August, and they had several meetings and signed a cooperation agreement, etc., etc. So this really trying to make the borders less important. Now there's also a costly border of being so difficult to fly and visit each other. But I think some of the, even though there was a state line at Hans Island, it talks into a long discussion about having this Inuit Nunat, that the home country of Inuit that goes beyond borders in a way.
All right, we still have another 4 minutes for questions. I was wondering if anyone has a question for panelists. All right, yes, please.
I'll just ask a question in terms of capacity. One of the things that you had mentioned, there was some resistance in the survey based on the issue of capacity. When you think of the size of Greenland relative to its population, relative to its income source to manage its resources, which is basically largely a block grant from Denmark, and Denmark's response being very logical, they're going to, you have X amount of resources coming from us to manage this. All these efforts will take additional management efforts. At the same time, Greenland's taken on its total responsibility for its natural resources, both renewable and non-renewable, biological. They manage all that now with sovereignty, basically, from Denmark. That takes a lot of resources. And if they are going to go into mining in a greater way, they need a regulatory structure similar to what you have in your Canadian provinces, which takes a lot more people than they've got. If you want to really manage the fisheries and do scientific management, you have to do sampling. And you have fairly good capacity on the fishery side, I would say. Quite good, actually. But you don't have that same capacity. You don't have the institutional experience within Greenmark itself, within the Inuit community. Most of your technical workforce there are folks rotating in and out from Denmark. So you have to build, in some sense, realistic what your priority and capacity building is, given your current mission and given your Paris, however you want to describe the government, at least I would say at a provincial or a state level at a minimum, and something greater than that. But that requires, again, a lot of resources. And it's a chicken or egg argument. You can't do the resources without the income. Income can't come without the development. So, but if you do the development before the resources are there to manage it properly, you would get situations like we saw with Manitoba, quite honestly. So, what's the solution there? What's the chicken or egg solution to building this internal capacity, both for these other organizational structures that you propose, but also for their current governance responsibilities? How do they do it?
So taking the mining sector as an example, there is a school and there is like education based on being able to going into business when it opened. If you go back to 2010 when Greenland took home the underground with the soil or the mineral sector of 2010, I think there was quite a lot of optimism that hasn't panned out, and there's only like 2 active mines in Greenland at the moment, none of them generating any substantial income for Greenland. So as long it's hard to, like, you have the chicken and the egg example, it's actually a quite good analogy, because there's not really money at the moment in the mining sector to develop local workforce, and we are short on staff in pretty much no matter what sector or field we're talking about in Greenland because of the small population, lack of education. So you started a mining school and hoping that was like the sentiments in 2010 was really optimistic. Now not so much. And then you have some politics. There was one mine was really controversial. The Greenland uranium mine, most of you have probably heard of, that could have generated some income, but we don't even know that. And then politics happened that the current premier, he's part of IAEA, is very much against uranium, has been since the 70s, basically. So I don't really know what to do, because there are a couple of potential mining projects that could open within the next couple of years. And somehow it's also, I think the US have succeeded in phasing Chinese actors out of that equation, so it wouldn't be vetoed by Washington for geostrategic reasons or whatever. But not really, not that much is going on, and for the whole sector to develop workforce and educated, that's one school, and the thing is going pretty well, but not really that much income coming from a sector that just 10 years ago we thought was going to phase out the block wind of Denmark, but nowhere near that's going to happen.
Very quickly, someone like to add something very quickly?
I mean, with the small population, with the financial subsidies from Denmark, it's, from my perspective, it's difficult to imagine Greenland becoming fully independent in the near future. However, it's clear that the relationship is evolving and self-determination is a real thing. So I think where Greenland is headed is to a status, I think, without precedent in international relations, as a self-representing actor with self-determination that nonetheless is not a fully sovereign state. And I can't think of another really good analogy in international relations. So, in a way, that's a very exciting thing.
If I can just answer with 2 words, and to link with other debates that have been happening at the Arctic Circle until now, I think that links to the question of just transition. If you're talking about uranium exploitation, what are the downfalls of the uranium exploitation? What is your timeline? Are you thinking about the next 5 years, or are you thinking about the next 15, 20, 30, 50? What generations are you thinking of? The next 7 generations or your own? So I think that would be my question back. It would be, this question is fundamental, and it links to the question of just transition. What kind of transition do we want, and how? And I will, link back to all of the debates that we've had at the Arctic Circle since the opening. And I think that would be my comment back, I guess.
Can I give feedback?
Very quickly. Go ahead.
Normally that's done through a spatial planning exercise, where it's mapped out, community inputs received, determination of which areas are appropriate for which activities, which sort of development are geospatially mapped. And again, that takes capacity within the government to do. So just transition still requires resources to manage properly within the government. And if the government can't afford those resources, you have the chicken or egg argument again. How do you do a just transition? So I suppose it's really the same question as I asked before. It's assumed that in a governance that you don't do mining unless it's permissible and acceptable by the communities. And in case you saw what happened when it wasn't, when the rare earths had a certain amount of uranium associated with it, and the community didn't accept that. But again, normally there would be a spatial planning process that would say this area is off limits because of these concerns, or this type of mining is allowed and this other type isn't. And so those sorts of efforts, again, really take a fair amount of governance at a state actor level, and Canadian province would do that work, for example, or an Alaskan state like Alaska would do that.
Thank you very much. This was a very passionate panel today. It was really interesting. If you want to speak with our panelists, I welcome you to maybe gather downstairs, because there'll probably be another panel here in a few minutes. So, but I encourage you to come and meet them. Thank you very much for being here this morning, and have a nice day.